Aliens Explored is a podcast exploring famous and obscure cases of UFO sightings, alien abductions and other strange events from both a believing and a sceptical perspective whilst keeping an open mind. I'm Stu Jackson, a professional actor and amateur ufologist with a particular interest in the crop circle phenomenon. I'll be debating that otherworldly visitations are real. The truth is out there.
And I'm Neil Kelly. I'm a professional actor as well and used to work for the military as an intelligence analyst. I'll be arguing from a more doubtful point of view. I mean, it's all a bit far-fetched, isn't it? The term UFO is correctly used to describe anything unusual we see flying in the sky, where we can't work out what it is. Some of these flying objects may indeed be of extraterrestrial origin, but many undoubtedly come from somewhere closer to home. Join us on Aliens Explored as we discuss man-made UFOs.
Hello listeners and welcome to Aliens Explored, your weekly podcast where we look at the skies above us, we look at historical cases, we look under the waters, we look everywhere for UFOs and aliens and otherworldly things. I think I've captured everything there, haven't I?
I think so, and we see them everywhere because that's the kind of people we are.
And this is one of your hosts, Neil Kelly.
Hello, and this is your other host, Stu Jackson. We've gone a bit too Ronnies.
And it's good night from him. No, don't go anywhere. It's not good night yet. Listen to the podcast first, because I've got quite an interesting podcast this week, I think. I always say that, though, don't I?
You always do, yes. And
but I've never been proved wrong.
Not been proven wrong, no. Has anyone listening out there who wants to prove Stu wrong? Well,
bring it. No.
Yeah, we accept the challenge.
No, if you do find any of the episodes less than enthralling, do let us know and let us know what sort of things you want to hear. This is as much your show, listeners, as it is ours. So anything you want to hear about, get in touch, let us know. You can email us at aliensexplored@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter and those usual places. And while we're on it, I was going to mention this at the end, but I'm going to mention it now instead. Wherever you listen to your podcast, do leave us a cheeky little review. And a star rating. It does help other people find this podcast, and we really appreciate it. And you'll be one of our favourite peoples if you do.
We'll love you for it forever.
Yes, indeed.
Oh, for a while, anyway.
Until the next fad comes along.
Yeah.
Yes. So bit of now. It's been a while. Neil, since we've actually recorded anything, hasn't it? Because of holidays and things like that.
All sorts of things like that. Obviously not a gap for our listeners because we've
because we recorded in advance and built up a stock, and now we haven't got a stock. And this episode goes out this Friday, and we're recording on Wednesday, so I'm going to be up against it. But it's worth it. It's worth it, certainly. But yeah, so what's anything UFO related, either fictional or factual, been going on in your life, Neil?
The short answer is no, but if possibly I could come up with something UFO. I don't think I've seen any movies. Or
don't make it up.
Any ideas? Some bloke the other day said something. No. How about yourself? Have you been probed?
Sort of. I mean, a little bit vicarious, but I've been. I mean, as you know, Neil, and as our listeners are about to find out, I've been away at a festival for 4 days in the depths of Wiltshire.
And you look it, I have to say.
Thank you. Yes, I'm peeling like buggery, which is I got all sunburnt and now I'm peeling. but I'll live. But yeah, I mean, Wiltshire, of course, is where the vast majority of crop circles happen. We didn't get to visit any crop circles, but a group of us as friends, I did take everyone to a visit to Avebury, which is Neolithic stone circle and quite closely related to ley lines and UFO activity and things like that. So didn't see any UFOs, but was in a UFO hotspot. That's what I was driving at there. Also, I just want to show off that I've been on holiday.
that is really UFO related.
It's
I can't claim anything like that. I was trying to remember if I'd watched a movie or seen anything on television, but I don't get out.
Well, we were going to have a look at for crop circles, but of course it's that time of year they've harvested them all. So,
I mean, there was a meteor shower when I was away on holiday in Norfolk, but cloudy, overcast sky, so couldn't see anything. So that's
okay.
That's where our American listeners often have an advantage if you're looking out into the clear blue skies above Nevada or Arizona. Then you're far more likely to see things than we are in cloudy, overcast England.
Yes, indeed. But something you might see, no matter where you are in the world, of course, is man-made flying saucers.
Right, so
did you like the segue there, Neil?
I did like the segue because that's what we're going to talk about today. Is it man-made? Are we just confining ourselves to man-made flying saucers, or man-made UFOs, or anything extraterrestrial related that's turned out to be terrestrial in origin?
That is a brilliant question. So when we initially sort of came up with the concept, I made a note, man-made UFOs. But the trouble with that is if you get a ball and throw it through the air and someone else sees it and doesn't necessarily recognize that it's a ball, but they see an object, that's a man-made UFO.
It is.
We want to limit it comes in the definition, don't we?
Well, I'm thinking, are we going to talk about objects that people have created to deliberately create the impression that it's an extraterrestrial visit, or are we talking about things that are terrestrial in origin that people haven't been able to identify, like an experimental aircraft or some trick of the light?
I'm with you. Well, we did the episode some months ago about UFO hoaxes, didn't we? So I feel like we've kind of covered that one for the most part. So this is more about, and I'll use the term sort of man-made flying saucers. I think that's probably a more closer to what we're aiming for here. So we're talking about craft that looks like UFOs, UAPs, flying saucers, whatever it is, but actually is definitely man-made. Yeah. Have you turned up anything in your research on this, Neil?
No, I just keep coming back to this list of UFO-related hoaxes.
So the oldest one that I've been able to identify, I think, actually there's a couple that could be that are quite old, but probably one of the most famous ones is the Gloch, or the bell, which was a Nazi creation. This one's more rumour than anything else, though. This bell-shaped craft, which was allegedly an anti-gravity craft, possibly even a time travel vessel as well. There's a lot about it on there. Vril powered, it's said by some. When we talked about the Vril Society recently, didn't we?
And we've talked about the Foo Fighters as well, which were thought to be advanced Nazi aircraft.
Yes. Yeah, well, the Foo Fighters is kind of the opposite, I suppose, of what we're talking about here, because the Foo Fighters, they saw and thought, oh, look, it's like it's man-made craft, but it's advanced man-made craft, but actually it wasn't.
I suppose if you're in a war, and especially a war like the Second World War, which lasts for several years, and during which there are a lot of technological innovations, You think a war that started with cavalry charges and biplanes and ended with ballistic missiles, jet aircraft, drones, nuclear weapons. So if you're attuned to think that anything that's in the sky that you can't recognise as friendly as one of your aircraft is an enemy aircraft, however strange it might look.
Yes. Totally agree. And in the same turn of foot, like we look at things today, and because of media, because of like science fiction movies and things like that, we now see a light sort of speeding across the sky, and we automatically go, "Oh, it's aliens." How many times has the Starlink train been misidentified as UFOs or alien craft? Because they're all lights travelling in a straight line, loads of them.
Well, that's something that's I've heard expressed before about all these people who have been, so many people have claimed to have been abducted by aliens or have seen UFOs. They are people who are known to have had a long time interest in UFOs. So how come it's these people who keep seeing UFOs? The ones who are just obsessed with them, who will bend your ear down the local bar if you let them about and go on about UFOs. I've certainly read about there's an awful lot of UFO reports associated with such people. Some of whom are probably our most avid listeners.
I would ask the question, like, are we sure it's that way around? Is this like more of a chicken and egg thing? Because, taking myself as an example, I had zero interest in UFOs. Zero interest in the whole culture until I had an experience myself. Then I got all interested in it. So all these people, yes, they might be really avid, people who just avidly absorb everything they can about the culture. But is that because of their experience rather than they happen to?
I wonder if it works the same way that if you've just watched a horror film about a home invasion or something, and then you hear some noise that you can't immediately identify downstairs in your house, you're probably more likely to be frightened by it if you've just watched a movie where that's the start of something horrendous and deadly than any other night. You might just have a more open mind about it. So perhaps, watching movies about UFOs will prime you to misidentify something you see in the sky that you can't identify.
Oh, very much.
Misidentify what you can't identify, yeah.
And that's what we're talking about, sort of auto-suggestion, where, your brain sort of fills in gaps, but it fills it in from where it's at that moment.
Yeah, because as psychologists have said, we are creatures who seek patterns, and we seek to explain things and fit things into context. And suddenly you see something that you've never seen before, but except the only place you've seen it is in a movie about UFOs or War of the Worlds or something. You think, oh, okay, that fits into that bit of what I know about the world. There's
a sort of almost practical application to that. I'm a member of a Facebook group that's all about faces in things, in inanimate objects, and people are like, post a picture of a house or a handbag, the way it's just been crumpled on the chair or whatever, and these things all look like they actually have faces. And that's exactly that phenomenon, that seeing patterns in things. But some of them look absolutely hilarious. So
yeah, but I mean, there was that famous picture of the face on Mars, which was first photographed by, was it the Viking 1 explorer in 1976, when we first sent a probe that far, and of course it turned out to be just a combination of shadows and poor image resolution, but it really looks like there's a face. There's a few lumps, but one of them really looks like a face.
It does, and that particular image has been used as an argument for Mars being occupied to this day. Is still used as an argument for that. We've digressed really far.
We do tend to do that. But talking about you talk about the earliest man-made UFOs. Probably the earliest one stems from man's first successful attempt to fly, when the Montgolfier brothers successfully launched a hot air balloon back in the 18th century. It was quite a simple balloon. It didn't have its own heat source attached to it. Basically, they heated it over a fire on the ground, and then when it had enough hot air in it, they released it with themselves in it, and I think an actress as well, for some reason. And they flew a certain distance, and then when they landed, because obviously something like will only go so far before the air cools and it comes down again, they were attacked with pitchforks by angry and frightened peasants who did indeed think they'd come from another world, because they'd never seen anything like it before.
Wow. That's an excellent example.
They barely escaped with their lives. Yeah, man-made UFO, not an attempt to deceive people, not an attempt to create a UFO hoax, but really just an experimental aircraft.
Well, yeah, and do you know what? There's an interesting takeaway from that. I'd not heard that story myself, but my brain's instantly gone to, why did they think they were from another world? Why was that their go-to explanation for this inconceivable thing that they'd seen?
I think in those peasants, the only thing they would have seen in the sky before would have been either a bird or something that had been thrown. And then suddenly there's this huge object coming down on them. Yeah.
But I bet they've gone to church every Sunday and heard all about, God in heaven or the angels and things like that. But they see a flying craft and instantly think, oh, they're from another world. That suggests something's happened in our collective sort of history, our genetic history.
Perhaps
to instantly go to that as an answer,
or perhaps the response of Aboriginal peoples of the Americas or the South Pacific, who had probably never been out of sight of shore in small canoes and fishing boats. Suddenly, these huge sailing ships arrive, peopled by people who look, I suppose, superficially like them. They're just a different colour and dressed very differently. Who in some cases proceed to slaughter them, or in some cases, like Captain Cook, end up getting slaughtered by the natives because they've certainly come from somewhere else. Mind you, those natives would tend to, I think, anyone who wasn't of their tribe was automatically an enemy.
Yes.
Better safe than sorry.
Self-protection thing. Bringing it round to actual sort of flying saucer-shaped vehicles. The earliest actual, so not in legend, not in speculative one, but actually physically exist. In fact, the craft itself still exists in a museum. Was from 1932. A Romanian called what's his name? Coanda, I think his name was. Henry Coanda created what he termed a lenticular flying machine. So this basically means a round flying machine. But back in 1932, he made a small scale model of it, which worked. And he was granted a patent in 1935 for it. I don't think it worked very effectively, though.
I mean, one of the Nazi, when we spoke about the Nazi secret weapons at the end of World War II, one of them was a plane where the wings were circular. If you saw it from below, it would look round with, you'd just be able to see the nose with a propeller. I think it was propelled, sticking out the front and a slight tail behind it. But generally, it was imagine like a delta wing aircraft, except the wings are a round shape.
Rounded.
Sorry, I'm gesturing. We're making gestures that our listeners won't be able to see. But yeah, from the ground,
they called it the
round.
Circular wing, didn't they?
Is that what they called it?
Wing, yes. I believe so, yes. Yes, that's a brilliant example.
I mean, wing design is a very complicated. There was. I know someone who worked on the design for Concorde, And they spent a very long time designing this unique wing shape, because Concorde was effectively a delta winged aircraft, but they needed a wing that would be stable in slow flight, when it's sort of cruising over areas where it's not allowed to go full thrust and break the sound barrier, or just sort of landing and take off, but also would be able to hold up in supersonic flight.
Yeah.
And of course, this was during the Cold War, and the Russians at this time were obviously taking a very keen interest. There were all sorts of espionage and counter-espionage activities, with all sorts of things like the constitution of the tyres. And they knew that Russians were sneaking out to the runway to take scrapings from from the skid marks where the aircraft would land. So they created this latex that was a bit like bubble gum, and spread that there and laughed at them at the thought of these Russian scientists trying to make tires out of bubble gum somewhere in Siberia. But the wing shape, it was so so hard to arrive at, and it was so complicated to make, that when the Russians produced their own version, their Concorde ski, it was just basically a box, a squared off delta wing. And then it had this little tail plane at the front, I think, above the cabin. And when when Concorde ski was first unveiled, a lot of experts just looked at it and said, "No way, that is supersonic." As it turned,
And was it?
I'm not sure that it was. No, it was called Concorde ski, and it crashed spectacularly at the Paris Air Show of 1974.
Oh, crikey!
But,
wow. I mean, do you know what? That's an interesting point. And so we're talking about flying saucer shaped craft, but of course, a lot of UFOs are delta shaped. So you look at like your flying wing, your B-52 bombers, your Concorde. They would be sort of UFO shaped man-made craft as well.
And also, of course, variable geometry aircraft that have wings that fold in and out, which is handy if you're parking them on an aircraft carrier. But also, you have these wings that come out to stabilize the aircraft when it's flying more slowly or needing to maneuver. But when you need the thing to just go full on, you just fold the wings in and it goes like a rocket.
Well, Concorde had a variable nose, as I recall.
I think it was only for when it was on the ground. So the pilots could see in front of the nose would droop down, and then when the nose would come up.
Right, because that was cheaper than doing a camera.
Or perhaps the technology.
Probably back then. Yeah.
I mean, you think that Concorde was, it was an aircraft that came into service in the 1970s, so based on designs from the 1950s. So that was one of the criticisms of the space shuttle, is that the Challenger that sadly blew up in 1986. They're saying, well, these things take so long. The process from conception to design to build to test to actually use is so long that it will always have technology that's 20 years out of date.
Yes. Okay, well, moving on to some others, there's a couple of examples of round craft that are based on basically like, how would I put it, sort of a horizontal turbine. There was the Avro car way back in 1958, which had a single turbine at its centre. It carried 2 crew members. The only trouble is it only hovered like 4 or 5 feet off the ground.
Right.
So it's actually seen more as an early sort of hovercraft, just without the skirt, basically. That's how it's perceived. But then there was the M200 series, which actually went into a bit of a production with the M200G Volanta, I believe. This is more 1970s. This one had a series of turbines around its edge, so that your pilot or your crew, only 2 crew members, but they would sit in the centre of it with a plastic bubble over their heads, and then you had, I think it was 6 turbines around the edge of it. That one was more successful, I believe. Yeah, and we know British Rail. We know British Rail very well, don't we, Neil? Being in Britain.
British Rail as was, or the new,
As was,
privatised,
yes,
franchised out.
But this was when it was a national company. In 1970, they developed their own flying saucer that even includes on its patent interplanetary travel.
Really?
Really, 1970. Now, this is a particularly interesting one from my perspective because they included as part of the plans, as part of the designs, superconductivity and nuclear fission before both things were discovered.
So atomic fission or nuclear fusion? Are we talking
nuclear fission?
So that's an atom bomb.
Yeah,
That's splitting an atom. That's splitting an atom.
Sorry, my bad. Nuclear fusion.
So that's welding two atoms together.
Yes, fusion. Sorry, not fission. Can't read my own writing. Yes, nuclear fusion. And superconductivities. But yeah, before these things were really
contemplated as a power source for craft, I suppose.
Now, since then, sort of scientists have looked at these designs and said, "Yeah, that wouldn't work. It'd kill everyone on board."
Well, I mean, a nuclear submarine, a nuclear-powered submarine, is effectively a steam engine. It's just that instead of a coal in the furnace, it's got decaying nuclear material generating the heat.
Yes,
to power the steam engine. But
that's how a power station itself works. It creates steam, which drives turbines, and that's what generates the electricity. That's all the power station is: a big kettle,
or a big dynamo, like on your on your bike.
Yeah, because I grew up near nuclear power stations, and you'd see these massive chimneys, and you'd see all these plumes of white coming out the top of them, like constantly, and people would look at us, all this pollution coming up. No, it's just steam. It wasn't pollution coming out of them at all. Just steam, just water.
Yeah, but I suppose you've got to be a bit suspicious around anything nuclear.
It's what you can't see with the radiation.
When you're being bathed in something that's coming from a nuclear power station, should I be worried about this? Is this really just steam?
Exactly. But it did strike me as a really weird one that, British Rail.
Now, I mean, the term flying saucer, wasn't that apparently a misnomer that a pilot described the UFO that he'd seen as having an erratic flight pattern, like a saucer, as if you skipped a saucer across water, that it was like bouncing. And a journalist translate that when it came out, he'd written that it was actually a saucer-shaped object. Is that where the flying saucer term comes from?
I'm feeling very proud right now because that was something, we talked about in a very, very early episode, and I'm really, really, impressed that you remembered it.
Oh, that's where I remember it from you.
Yes.
So I'm reminding you about a thing that you reminded me of.
I mean, it wasn't so much that he misnamed. He called it a flying saucer, but his intention was describing the movement rather than the shape of it. But it was then later by others sort of taken away to, and it was describing a disc-shaped object. So it's an easy mistake to make. But no, it was the movement he was trying to convey.
I remember when the frisbee craze started. I'm old enough to remember the 1960s when frisbees first came out over here. I think they'd been in America for a while, but they were new here and advertised on television. Everyone wanted a frisbee, and of course, printed on it said "Whammo Frisbee Flying Saucer." So, of course, it's exactly what it was. Yeah. You could even use it as a plate if you turned it upside down.
Now, I've literally got this from the Back to the Future movies, but in the third Back to the Future movie, Marty McFly has a pie, and it is frisbee pies, and the plate it's on, I think he actually uses it as a frisbee.
Okay.
But yeah, so I'm wondering, like, is that historically correct that frisbees were actually pie makers and people used their plates as toys?
It probably started with that, didn't it? That someone's
You can imagine
people
can't you?
throwing around a metal plate or a plastic plate. Well, maybe they're throwing around a metal plate, which
Yes.
which is great fun until someone got their skull split open by it.
I was going to say, if they're throwing around a plastic plate in frontier times, that's definitely alien involvement.
Yeah, but then someone thought, "Oh, this is a great game. Let's make it a bit safer with rounded edges and such."
Yeah,
and plastic.
Interesting. But if you know, listeners, do let us know. Well, gosh, we're here at the half hour mark. We'd better summarise what we think. Now, I'm gonna postulate a theory to you, Neil, and see what you think of this. I think that of the man-made let's stick with the flying saucers. No, do you know what? I'm going to incorporate the deltas into this as well. I'm going to postulate that, at very least, the visual design, if not some of the technology, is from otherworldly visitors. What do you think?
I think that's possibly a bit fanciful. I think that aircraft designers, they spend an awful lot of time trying to optimize whatever it is they're trying to do, whether they're trying to optimize lift or speed or invisibility on radar, and the shapes come out of that they perhaps see, even computer aided design, that they program what their requirements into a computer and it comes up with a particular shape. These shapes are very difficult to arrive at. But I could tell you that rather than from actual UFOs, I think there's an awful lot that comes from science fiction. That it has often been said, if you want to have a look at what the future might look like, look at science fiction rather than science fact. There was a famous story about Dick Tracy, who will be more the comic book detective, who will be more familiar to our American listeners than to our British listeners, despite the Warren Beatty film of about 1990 odd. Dick Tracy, and these were cartoons from the 1940s. He had a radio in his wristwatch. I think it had an aerial sticking out of it, and the comic would be calling Dick Tracy. And the scientists at the time said, well, that's impossible. You can't have a radio in a wristwatch because a radio is a big thing. In those days, a radio was a piece of furniture, basically. Yeah. And where would you fit all the valves and everything? Because they were their imagination was limited by what they knew was possible at the time. And of course, the science fiction writers just said, well, I don't care. I'm not thinking about the technology. I'm just saying he's got this thing. Work it out for yourself how it's possible. And I think a lot can come from that. A scientist, a science fiction writer comes up with an idea, and that takes off.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you know, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and there are many examples of, and scientists will say, I was inspired by what I saw on Star Trek to invent this thing. That's a very, very common thing.
Yeah, and there are even books on the science of Star Trek. how the interstellar drive works, how the transportation chambers would work, or what would be the fit, the science behind it.
Or you can ask me, because I've read them all. I am considered as something of a not expert, but I know my shit.
Well, as much as anyone who's ever written it.
Probably close. Back onto topic then. So I get what you're saying about, that you look for the most efficient design, but surely to look for the most efficient design, you look to nature and you can say, okay, we want a vehicle that's going to fly. Well, what already flies? Birds fly. Yes. And they've got wings and, they've got like pointed front ends. You don't see in nature a flying saucer shaped bird.
No, and
a
yet
round bird.
the way that birds fly is something we haven't ever really been able to replicate. I mean, there were some early aircraft. They call them ornithopters, which is a plane that flies by flapping its mechanical wings. And all right, they can get it to fly off the ground. They can get it to lift off, but they can't do all the complicated things that birds can do, to rotate it, to sort of come in for a landing on something, or to snatch something out of the come down and snatch prey, that sort of thing. We just don't have the materials that can take the stresses that will be involved in that.
No, our aircraft is more based on things like the Hawk, so ones that glide and without flapping the wings, they use the airlifts. But yeah, I think looking at these round, I don't know, they're getting their inspiration from somewhere. I don't think it's computer design either, because computer design would go for some more delta shapes and
Or in the case of Concorde, which was a very, very complicated requirement that needed to be able to take the supersonic speed and be stable in slower flight. There's an American spy plane called the Blackbird.
Yes.
It was. I remember once it was coming over to Britain for an air show, and it started. It was going so fast that as it started to slow down over somewhere of the English Channel, by the time it had completed its turn, it was over Amsterdam. And apparently, because it gets so hot, because it's going so fast, there's so much friction generated, it actually changes shape. That I think there's something like it grows an extra foot in length.
Wow.
And they have to be able to build that into the design, that it won't distort, that it will. And apparently the fuel tanks are porous. They can only fuel it right before it takes off, and then they will become sealed in flight.
Wow!
But
all
these things you have to take into consideration. Just the effect on materials of going at that speed and getting that hot.
There's definitely a lot to it. Anyway, we've gone way past our time. So, so listeners, what do you think about the man-made flying saucers? Do you think they're inspired by otherworldly visitors, or is it just kind of a natural evolution in normal flight? Do let us know via the usual methods. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter. You can email us at aliensexplored@gmail.com. But don't forget to join us next time. Oh, Neil, we talked about Close Encounters of the Third Kind recently.
We did.
We're going to be talking about the alleged real-life version of that next week. We're going to be talking Project Serpo.
I look forward to it.
Excited for that. In the meantime, listeners, keep watching those aircraft coming off the assembly lines.
Yes.
Why not?
Yes. Don't hang around experimental aircraft bases with the binoculars. Not a good.
Don't do that.
Idea. It's not a good.
But do watch them anyway, and the skies. Take care for now.
Catch you next time. Bye bye.
Aliens Explored is a Figo Films production in association with Juicy Falls. Music by Darren Mafucci and editing by Stu Jackson. Find us on Twitter and Facebook by searching Aliens Explored or visit aliensexplored.com.